Today we're going to be making fences for 28 millimeter games. These are rail fences that suit well for kind of Wild West all the way back to kind of French Indian War. Even into modern times you'll still see rail fences like this used. I made 8 of these. They're really easy and simple to make, and I like them so much I decided to make 4 more and show you guys how I make them. You can see they're about 3 inches long or so, little maybe about an inch high. So there it is with a Great Escapes Games model for size comparison. So the bases are just made from this very thin balsa wood that I had a whole bunch of scraps left over for. The rails and posts are all made from these crafting matchsticks, a whole bunch of them. So what I did with the balsa wood is I cut a bunch of inch strips, not quite an inch wide. I just kind of eyeballed something that looked like it'd make a good base. And so now we're going to cut the strips down, and so I said about 3 inches. I measured twice, cut once, but the idea was to get them about 3 inches long. After we've cut off all the excess, so they're all 3 inches, about the same length, it's time to get out all the pieces we need for the rails. Now the nice thing with how I designed this kind of on the fly is each fence is going to need a total of 7 of these sticks, and we're going to use pretty much all the pieces of it. So the rail lengths are about 1 3/4 inches, and I felt like 2 of those together on a 3-inch base gives enough overlap to look appropriate. So I just measure each one out, cut it right about 1 3/4 inches, and save the cutoffs because we're going to use those in a minute. So after cutting 7 rails for each of the 4 fences, I cut them off to the side. Now we're going to take these cut off scraps and we're going to make the next piece. So we're going to trim these down to between 1/3 of an inch and 1/8 of an inch. And the larger section is going to be our posts, and the smaller sections we'll also save, and those are going to be our spacers at the ends as we build this rail fence up. Cutting all these pieces is probably the most time-consuming spot, but it's good to take your time in your measuring so they're all about the same length, that we have consistency and you don't run into issues later. But we're going to go through all of them cutting. Now that we have all of our pieces cut, we're going to begin on this assembly stage. Now for the first layer of the fence, I like to use a hot glue gun. Once it's heated up, the glue goes on very easily, as long as you're careful about stringing, and it gives you enough working time, but also a quick bond. So I lay down the first base, 3-inch base. I put a rail across. I take a post, put a little glue on the bottom, and as you can see, I plop it down, anchoring both the rail and the post to the balsa wood base. And I'm just eyeballing center. The fence is supposed to represent something back, 1700s, so you don't have to be super precise. But this, the post on either end kind of anchors that rail down. Then you take a spacer to put at the far end, and post on either side of it. And that part can be a little hard because you don't want them to be too off from center, or you could have issues when you're trying to place each row going up. Once I completed the first side, I went down and did the next side, the same thing. A post at either end. Now when you're putting a post in the middle, you're going to think the rails are going to overlap, and you want it to kind of run up the seam of the overlap as best you can. Then set it off to the side and you start on the next one until you've done however many you're doing. So here, just another angle close-up of what I'm doing on the next fence. So you can see after putting some hot glue, I'm putting it down, locking both of those in. Not really worried too much about if it's perfectly straight all the time, because it's supposed to be an old fence, like I said. And again, that little spacer at the end, those are our little cutoffs, the last little pieces, and we're saving those. They can be a little fiddly to get in, but I find working with the hot glue is pretty good. And if you make a mistake, it's pretty easy to kind of pull those off as well. Now that we have all the fence base sections and the first layer of rails and all the posts in, because it's hot glue, it's dries super fast. So now we're going to glue all the rails in going up. This is the fun part. For this I use Mod Podge because I want a little bit more working time, and you'll see why as we go up. So we're just going to get a big glob of glue and put it at the end of the rail, at the end of the fence, put a spacer in. And I like to do this first because when you put the glue on the next layer, if that spacer hasn't set just a little bit, it's easy to knock it off. But then we do the same thing at the other ends, on the top of the rail and then on the top of the spacer. Try not to get too much glue on the faces of the rail. It's fine, or the post, it's fine to get it up the inside as you put layers in. But then we just take our next rail layer, see, and really it only needs to be kind of flush at the end of the whole fence section. But you can see I've got a whole lot of overlap there with my center posts, so I didn't line them up perfectly. But once it's all done, it's on the table, it looks fine. But then we're adding more glue and another spacer, and then on the other end, glue, and then it'll be another rail. Now you can see here when I have put a layer on, it moves and shifts the layer below. Everything's not perfectly level, not perfectly straight, but that's fine, and that's why I like working in Mod Podge, because once you get all the layers down, you can kind of press them firmly in place and let it dry that way. You can also add a little bit more glue as you need. But yeah, that's why we save all the spacers and all the pieces, because with the 7 rails, you pretty much have enough pieces for the entirety of the fence. So for all the posts and all the spacers. You can see here I almost forgot to put a spacer in, and it's kind of easy when you're trying to get into the rhythm of making something like this to miss a step. And again, that's why I like using the Mod Podge. It's very forgiving. If I've put it down in one spot and I wasn't ready yet, it's not going to dry on me like a super glue might, or even the hot glue. I have made one prior using all hot glue, and I didn't like how it bulged out on the seams too much, even though I felt like it gave me a good amount of working time. It didn't look very good, as good anyway, on the finished product. And so that's one fence done, and then we just rinse and repeat with all of them. Now that they've all been assembled, the Mod Podge does need time to dry. I like to give it about a day to dry, or at least 8 hours. So if I've done this in the morning before a shift, then I think it's good by the time I get home, or if I do it before I go to bed, the next day when I have time to get to it, it should be good. So the next step, now that they're dry, is we're going to bevel the edges. This allows you to place the fence at different angles without the bases getting in each other's way. Now I didn't record the video audio because I have music playing in the background, so now I'll add the sound effects. So snip, 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 snip. Now that we've beveled the edges, we're going to paint it. Now, I really liked using just a wash over this kind of plain wood, and for that I use Army Painter's mild brown wash. When it's dry, it kind of gives it an oldish looking fence, but not straight to gray. So just squirted some in my palette, got a helping on the brush, and then get it everywhere. The one problem I ran into is wherever I got Mod Podge on the facing of the wood, so if it was on the sides or outside of the posts, the wash doesn't really like to adhere there very well. I didn't worry about it too much. When you see the final results, I think you'll agree, it just kind of adds to this randoming weathering that a fence left outside might get, certain areas weathering more than others. So don't worry about it too much, but that's why I said earlier, try to be careful where you smear the Mod Podge everywhere, because it will affect how the wash soaks up. If you're not using a wash and you're using paints, that'll be less of a problem. As we finish up the first one, set it off to dry, and we're going to move on and do the same thing on all the rest of them, the other three. Just lathering on shade over the whole thing, not worrying about too many glops or stuff here because it all adds to the more randoming weather effect. Now that those are all dry, and they should be dry by the time you finish the last one, we're going to work on the basing. And so for this, I just use sand, just kind of a medium grit sand when working on terrain. Everything from fine to kind of medium grit I think works fine. But this is just a decorative sand from the States. And so I just pour a helping in a bowl, and it helps reduce the mess, and it'll go back in the container when I'm done. To stick it onto the bottom of the bases, again, I'm going to be using Mod Podge. Kind of just a really great all-around white glue. I think any white glue works fine for this process, but matte Mod Podge is my preferred one. So we just take the fence, dab or not necessarily dab, but cover the base with Mod Podge, trying not to get it too much on the fence posts or rails. I do try to cover up the hot glue glob that's at the bottom as best I can, but you'll see the finished product's not really that noticeable once you've gotten your basing material on and the rest of the static grass and tufts and things like that. After I've covered the whole bottom in glue, I just kind of run it through the sand, getting it on both sides. Trying to make sure it's got full coverage. And then I'm going to just gently tap it to knock off excess. Not too hard to knock it loose from the glue, but anything that's not stuck to glue you want to knock off. And then I'm going to do the next one. I'm just going to go down the line, giving the prior ones time to dry before we go on to the next step. And with all 4 of them covered in sand, we're going to go straight on to flocking. And I'll explain a little bit later why I don't wait in between. But I'm just using this Army Painter Battlefield Grass Green flock. It's one of those really fine, almost like sawdust style of flock, as opposed to static grass. Usually on my bases, I like to mix this with static grass, but for the fence, it's got good coloration, kind of the yellows and the greens that fits in well, and I'm going to be using a few static grass tufts that I think will work better for both arid and non-arid landscapes. So similarly to how we did with the sand on, I'm going to get my Mod Podge glue and just dab it on, not covering fully, but more than about 50%, I'd say, of the base is going to be a visible base, is going to be in grass. Again, trying not to get too much on the fence itself. And then fortunately, the little tray is just big enough, so I use the back of my brush to kind of push it up onto the glue and gently press it in so it really sticks into the glue. Tap the excess off and flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. Then, like everything else, it's just a case of rinse and repeat on all the fence sections. I'm trying to not do any patterns, so trying to vary it, but on each one a little bit different. There's a limited amount of space, and there's even just with 4, you're going to have it look a little bit similar, but trying to keep it a little bit different between each one was the goal. Now we're on to the second to last step, and we're going to take some watered down Mod Podge. I couldn't tell you the ratio, I've made this a long time ago, but you can look up other stuff. You just want it to be liquidy, as you can see, so it can come out of a pipette. And I like to use the pipette for just better control, and we just put a thin layer over top of the flock and the sand, and that'll soak through both and lock them all in place. It makes it a lot more durable, lasts a lot longer. This is also a good thing to do on your miniature bases. I don't as often because I find my miniature bases themselves aren't going to see as much action as like terrain bases might. But if you want your static grass and dirt stuff to last, this is a good way to do it. Now this step I actually leave to dry overnight again. You really don't want to mess with it because it's actually easier to knock it all off now that you've soaked it. So it's best to let it dry for a while. Once it has dried, we're going to go to the final step, and that's these grass tufts. These are from Huge Miniatures in the US. I really like their grass tufts. I've used them a lot. They do really good flowers, really good static grass. They even do flocking material for trees and kits for that. I highly recommend them. And again, I'm just going to use Mod Podge to attach these. You could use super glue, but I think the Mod Podge dries better. So I'm just going to dab on a little drop of glue, and I don't want too much on either side, so I'm usually only doing 1 or 2 per side. And again, just trying to pick a little spot where the sand is, make it look a little random, and put down a little bit of glue. Then all you need to do is, I will just pull the tuft off with my fingers. You can use tweezers and just plop it in onto the glue, give it a little push, set it in, and then just leave it to dry, and it'll be good to go. So, a little plop. Dab, 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 plop, 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 and a little dab, and a little dab, and another little dab, and a little plop, and a plop, and a plop. Then another dab, and another dab, and a dab, and a plop, and a plop, and a plop. And just like that, they're done. And you can see with the beveled edges, you can put them together in different pretty sharp angles, and they go together nicely. The more you have, the more complex fence layouts. I haven't figured out how to do gates yet, but considering the time period, I'm not really too worried about gates. I might figure out something later. But so there it is with the 28mm model, and stick around and I'll show you some shots with them on the table. Thank you for watching this tutorial. It's just my second one, and I tried to make it a little bit more entertaining and not so long and boring. If you liked it, maybe leave me a like and a comment. Especially appreciate comments with suggestions. This is something I like to do more of, and so knowing what you think of it is very helpful. And until next time, see you later.